Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to talk about variegation reversion on shrubby plants or plants which are perennials. So variegation reversion is quite a common occurrence, especially on a plant that's slightly stressed, but it can happen randomly at any point in the plant's life. So I'll go into a bit of why plants are variegated, and that will give a bit more of a clear answer as why they revert back to green. So this is my hedge here. You can see it's starting to revert back to a green colour. Now most plants originally they will be green because variegation is basically in most cases is an absence of chlorophyll, and so what you're getting here on this yellow version is the yellow sections don't have as much chlorophyll, so that these don't actually absorb as much energy from the sunlight and can't produce as much energy as a green leaf can. But these mutations that occur very rarely in nature, but whenever they do, us humans tend to select them and grow the plants because we find them much more attractive than the standard green variety. It's something unusual, gives an extra bit of colour, so we tend to keep these varieties. So what can happen is the plant can then go back to its original form with the green leaves. This can happen randomly just through genetic mutations or expression of the plant genes, but it's more likely to happen if the plant is stressed with low light levels or maybe drought or damage, something like that. It's more likely to go back to green. Now the reason this can be a bit of an issue is the green growth is going to be much more vigorous. It photosynthesizes a lot more than the variegated form, and so this will grow much faster and more vigorous than the yellow leaves. So if you bought a plant and you wanted it with this nice green and yellow variegation, if it starts to revert back to green, what you'll find is these sections will grow much faster than the original variegated sections, and it will slowly become green. So you can see there's quite a few bits on here which are already starting to turn green, and these will spread, and this whole hedge will eventually turn green if I do nothing about it. So what you want to do is, as soon as something starts to revert back to the green with a variegated plant, what you want to do is act sooner rather than later. That way there's going to be less material that you need to cut out. So I'm going to use this cord of my hedge as an example. Now when the plant reverts, it doesn't happen very often, but when it does, as I say, it tends to take over and become dominant. So you can normally trace it back to a single point. Now on a hedge like this, it has reverted in several places. There's several points of reversion, so I need to cut every single one out individually. But what you want to do is track back to the original point of reversion and cut it out at that point. If you don't go low enough down, it will just keep resprouting green, and once a variegated plant goes green, it almost never goes back to the variegated colour. So I need to cut this quite far back because it's not going to become yellow again. And the reason you want to do this early on is because if it's just a small section such as this bit up here at the back, that's quite easy to remove. I can just go back to where it's reverted and I can simply just cut that out. And it's just a small section, and you can see there's not really much of a hole left in the plant. It's not a big issue. If you get it early on, you can stop too much damage from occurring. But if you leave it a bit longer, like this one here, you have to take out a large section of the stem. Then you're going to have quite a bit of a gap in your hedge, and it's going to look a bit unusual for a few months until it regrows and fills that gap. Now the bigger the section of green, the more it's going to look unusual once you cut it out. So if you can, as soon as you see any reversion, cut it out as soon as possible, and you're going to minimize any of the damage that can happen in the future. Now of course, if you don't mind a green plant, you could just let it go green, and you will actually lose the whole variegation eventually. But I wanted to keep my hedge as this nice variegated color. So what I'm going to do on this hedge is take out all these variegated sections, show you how patchy it looks with them taken out, and then show you how it will slowly heal over time. So I use this section as an example of how to take it out. You can see we've got plenty of variegated foliage around the outside. In the middle, there's definitely a section here which is reverted. I need to carefully pull this back and have a look and see if I can find the original source of the where it started the change. So you can see these stems down here. These are all green, and they do appear to come all the way back to this point. So I'm going to cut it down quite low and making sure all the branches coming up from this are green and not variegated. So we've taken that off, and as you can see, completely green. There's no variegation on that at all. And if I take that away, I check here again, make sure there's no green left, and I can't see any green sections. So it looks like I've got the whole section of variegated growth taken out. So that should be fine. I need to make sure I cut it back to the main stem. You can see I cut it right off here. I want to cut it as low as possible to the main stem, just to discourage this shoot from sprouting, because if that sprouts, it will most likely be green. So as long as I've cut below the reversion point, then it should come back as yellow, and any of this surrounding growth should also come in and fill it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to continue with the rest of the hedge, taking out all these patchy bits. I'll then give you a photo of what it looks like once all the green sections have been taken out. I'll show you some before photos before I take out the green sections, after taking out the green sections, and then after I've pruned it. And then I'll come back at the end of the year once we've had a summer of growth, and we'll see how much these are starting to fill in. Because you can see there'll be sections like this where there will be unsightly gaps, but if I do this now, in the long term I'll keep a nice variegated hedge instead of going completely green. So hopefully you can see from those photos how it's greened up over the summer. It's now October time, so this isn't really going to grow much more. It's got a small amount of growth just coming through at the moment, but the frost will kill off any of this fresh growth, and with the colder temperatures coming, this is going to stop growing from now on. So this is basically as much as it's recovered between the months of June and October here in North Scotland. If you're in a more tropical place, you can keep doing this year round, it will keep filling in. So this is what it should look like after you've allowed it to regrow. You can see it's covered up nicely. This was the biggest wound originally. You can see here it's filled in nicely. It's mostly filled in from around the edges. That's because I cut that main stem off at the main shoot, so it hasn't actually resprouted, and I can show you where I cut that off. So I actually cut off that stem in June, around about this point here. You can see there's not any new shoots coming off. That's because I cut it right next to the stem. There's growth above it which suppresses it with hormones to stop it from reshooting from lower down. So if you've done that, it should be good. It shouldn't resprout green now, and that section should stay variegated for quite a long time. There are one or two places where the variegation has been lost again. That isn't so much this time from it reverting back, it's probably just because I didn't manage to cut out all the green. So I'll show you those sections on my hedge now. Now unfortunately I planted my garden up quite a bit since I've done the first video, so I can't show you the hedge too well because this big ricinus plant is in the way. But generally you can see there's a lot less holes than there was originally at the end of the last pruning I did. Now there are still some gaps such as this here, but certainly not as bad as it was at the beginning of the video when I first cut back any of the green growth. So it's starting to fill in nicely, and by the end of next summer this will be completely covered up. There won't be any gaps in this hedge, and it'll just be a nice variegated hedge again. Now there is a couple of places where it has started to go green. You can see, for example, there's a green shoot here, another green shoot there, and as you can see they do tend to be much stronger and taller than the variegated ones because they can photosynthesize better, so the plant will focus its energy into that. So looking down here, it looks like I cut it off around about this point previously. I should have probably gone further down and cut that off lower. So what I'll be doing now is I'll be cutting off any of the remaining green shoots. I'll just be continuing this every year or so. What should happen is there'll be less and less green regrowing, and eventually it will just be spontaneous reversions back to the green, and that'll be probably only 1 or 2 a year. This hedge is actually very old. It's probably about 30 or 40 years old, and although it had about 20 reversion sites on it, it probably only had 1 or so every year or 2. So it shouldn't happen very quickly, but it's a slow process, and if it's left for a long time, that's when it can get into this bad state where there's loads of green sections. Now there's one more thing I'd like to add when it comes to reversion. Now sometimes if it's the whole plant that seems to be reverting back to green and it's not 1 or 2 shoots, that isn't necessarily the plant reverting back to green permanently. That might just be a short-term thing because of low light levels. So this hedge shows it quite nicely. So this hedge, it gets a lot more sun on this side than the other side. You can see in this side, nice and yellow, apart from a couple of reversion sites, it's a nice variegated form, especially in the top where it gets the most light. But when I come down to the shadier sides, you can see it's less pronounced, the variegation. It's still there, so it's not completely lost, but the less light there is, the less pronounced the variegation is going to be. So for example, we've got some here which look completely green. So these do actually have the variegation, but because of the low light levels, these have actually lost most of that variegation. It's not obvious. When the light levels increase, it should look more like this again. And you can see here, this is one that has reverted. It's got that dark green. So this one does need to be removed. This one here, it's unlikely that it's an issue. If it does go dark green in the future, it doesn't have any signs of variegation, I will cut this off, but that one's probably okay. And you'll have other ones as well, such as this, where the variegation just tends to fade. It's less pronounced, that's fine. That's basically just low light levels. So if that happens on your plant, or basically the whole thing starts to lose its variegation, or the variegation just fades, it's more of a cultural problem. Just give it more sunlight and it should come back. You should get that nice variegation back on your plant. It just needs brighter light levels. But if the green is very pronounced and it's just coming through like this on individual sections, that definitely needs to be cut out. If it's the whole thing just generally fading down and going back to green, it's a low light level thing. So that's all for this video. Hopefully you found it useful. As I say, when it comes to variegation reversion, the quicker you act, the better. The less holes you're going to be left with in your plant, and the more plant material you'll be able to save.